my message to them would be to say, for heaven's sake, wake up, smell the coffee, and live in 21st century Britain. You can't aspire to lead a nation unless you reflect that nation. And that's exactly why we had no problem with having two women prime ministers. We've had ethnic cabinet ministers far more than any other party. And I think our first ethnic minority British Indian prime minister would entirely be consistent with that bill, just as it was almost going back to Disraeli, for heaven's sake. So no Conservative should ever have any qualms about that.
Now to Sir Bob Neill, the Conservative MP for Bromley, chair of the Justice Select Committee. Sir Bob, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Cathy.
So are you backing Rishi Sunak?
Yes, I shall be. I've
Right.
decided that I think Rishi has what it takes to do the job, and he's a man of seriousness. There are other excellent candidates in the field. I want to see Tom Tugendhat in the new government. I think he's something that really brings something to the future of the party, and there are other very strong contenders. But on balance, I think Rishi is the person who is most able to unite the party.
What do you think of those criticisms? You might have just heard Patrick Maguire talking there about people he's spoken to, some of your colleagues, worrying that, is Rishi Sunak a bit too slick? There's style over substance. And also to talk in his video about being responsible fiscally. Well, a lot of other people are saying, actually, you need to go back to the kind of red meat of Tory tax cuts. What do you say to those two criticisms?
Well, I certainly want to see tax cuts, actually, but I do think they've got to be responsible ones, because at the same time as we've got a problem with too high a level of tax in the country, we've also got record levels of debt, and we need to deal with that too. I think it's getting the tax cuts in the right places that are required, and I think he's got the experience to do that. We need to move on in our tone and our substance. I think Rishi's also shown himself to be a man of seriousness. When I worked with him on issues which concern me, like the UK Internal Markets Bill a couple of years ago, which had some quite profound legal consequences, he showed a real willingness, I think, to listen and to compromise and take on some of the important rule of law arguments, which are important to me, Cathy. So that's something that weighs heavily with me too.
Well, do you know, he's obviously got a battle on his hands. He's going to be put under pressure. He's been put under a lot of pressure and was quite defensive about his wife's finances, for example. How do you think he's going to cope in the next few weeks with that kind of scrutiny about his wealth and his personal situation?
Well, it would be a funny thing if a Conservative thought it was an impediment to someone to have been successful and to have come up from a very ordinary suburban background, just exactly as I did. So I can identify with that.
Well, he did go to public school, though, didn't he?
Yeah, well, a lot of people, again, have made their way because their parents were able to make some money and invested in their education. That's what my wife's family did as well. So I don't think that should be held against anyone either. And maybe the fact that that scrutiny has been up there indicates that he's been able to deal with that. But the key thing is, he is, I think, somebody whose personal circumstances, his personal life has been irreproachable. And he's someone, I think, shows seriousness. I think that's the thing. We've got to move away from the boosterism and the overpromising that we've seen, I'm afraid, in the last couple of years, and level with people. And as you know, Cathy, I've been saying that on my media in interviews consistently over the last few days. At that stage, I didn't know if Rishi was standing, but that's consistent, I think, from my point of view. And I think we now need to find someone who could meet that bill and move forward. And as a London MP, Cathy, with the most diverse city in London that my constituency is part of, I think it's an extraordinary thing that we could have someone who's of British Indian heritage in a city like mine to be our next Prime Minister.
Well, you talk about his British Indian heritage. Obviously, he, in that sense, is very much the new face of the Conservative Party. How do you think some of the more reactionary Conservative members might respond to that? How do you think he'll fare if he gets the last two with the grassroots?
I think that would be a terrible indictment of the Conservative Party, if anyone, to think in that way. And I think that my message to them would be to say, for heaven's sake, wake up, smell the coffee, and live in 21st century Britain. You can't aspire to lead a nation unless you reflect that nation. And that's exactly why we had no problem with having two women prime ministers. We've had ethnic cabinet ministers, far more than any other party. And I think our first ethnic minority British Indian Prime Minister would entirely be consistent with that bill, just as it was, almost going back to Disraeli, for heaven's sake. So no Conservative should ever have any qualms about that.
Well, so Bob, you were quietly devastating about the Prime Minister in your dissection of him in front of the committee this week. Are you content for him to stay as Prime Minister until the autumn, or do you think he can do a lot of damage in that time?
I think he should go sooner. He will be circumscribed and constrained by the sensible people who have been brought into the cabinet. And I think he's not entirely master of his own destiny in that regard. But I do think the process needs to be speeded up and he ought to be gone sooner, Cathy. His situation, the manner of his leaving is different from that of his predecessors because it does relate to his personal character and integrity. And that's much harder, I think, for many people to stomach for any period of time once that's happened. And also, it's in the country's interest and the Conservative Party's interest, because I think we need profoundly to press the reset button. And the longer that takes, the harder it is to do and to get on with those serious issues we were talking about, the economic challenges that we face, the need to bring the party together, restore trust in politics.
But you can't speed up the process of electing a new leader much more than is currently proposed unless you let MPs make the decision about the successor rather than going to the grassroots, as John Major proposed.
Well, I think that's difficult. I understand what John meant, but it's not, I think, the right answer because, a political party needs a partnership between its parliamentarians and its grassroots activists. So they're the people who go out and put the leaflets out for us and bang on the doors. So you've got to take them with you, and changing it unilaterally would not be fair. What I do think that we can do, and I was talking to some of my senior activists about this, in fact, the way we do the party's elections has modernised a lot more since then. If we can get the parliamentary element of the process done before the recess, and we can certainly do that. I've urged my friends on the 1922 to even try and do it next week if we can. Nowadays, we have a centralised membership base. We have centralised membership records, so we've got all those available very quickly. We've already got systems for selecting things like our big regional mayor candidates and so on online by electronic voting. We've got emails. We can do web streamed hustings, so you don't have to go through the old sort of analogue system that we've had in the past. So I think we should be aiming to get this done during the summer. People aren't going to be away for a whole month.
Okay.
And so it's finished, Cathy. In other words, that the new person is in place by the time Parliament comes back on the 5th of September.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a tall order, and you don't want a kind of interim prime minister in that time. You're happy.
Well, I would have preferred. As I think you've probably heard me saying, Cathy, that it would have been better, I think, if the prime minister had stood down immediately, and that Dominic Raab, who is after all the deputy prime minister and Lord Chancellor, and isn't a candidate, doesn't have any skin in the game, had been the interim prime minister. That ship seems to have sailed. I do think an opportunity was missed there. That's still not impossible to revert to that, and I'd urge people to keep that in their back pocket in case my preferred option takes longer than I would like. But the key thing is to get everything done and in place as soon as we practically can.